What's up, everybody? And today we're checking out the most disturbing human experiment ever. This is by Wendigoon. So I put a video out a while back. It was either like the Mr. Ballin video or the Fat Electrician video. And I put out a statement and I said that the Fat Electrician and Mr. Ballin are the best storytellers on YouTube. And the amount of comments that said you need to check out Wendigoon then and add him to your favorite storytellers of all time because he's really good. So we're going to do that today. I have actually checked out Wendigoon back in 2022. I reacted to the conspiracy theory iceberg. With that being said, though, it wasn't really much of a story as it was just him giving information. Whereas this one, I've been told, is more of a story. It's the most disturbing human experiment ever. It's him talking about one subject rather than rating a bunch of subjects, which can be kind of hard in a storytelling fashion. So yeah, I'm excited for this. You know me. If you've been watching this channel for a long time, you know me. I'm really keen on storytelling. The way that people tell story, I think, are incredibly important and very overlooked in the modern day, right? And so I'm hoping I get just as much satisfaction out of this. But I mean, it's got nearly 6 million views, and Wendigoon's got 3.84 million subscribers. So I'm sure he is as good as I think he's going to be. Do I need to say anything else before we get started? Yes, I do, actually. I do. Finally, I can talk to you guys about it. The weekend just gone, I announced Morale, which is my new drink that I'm making. I am so excited to tell you all about it. We made a really good video that is here on my YouTube channel. It will actually be the previous video to this because it came out Friday night. And there's also a website. Check out drinkmorale.com. Go over there. And if you sign up and put your email in before the drink is released, you're going to be labeled as an original. All right? See what I did there? And what that does is during the development of the drink, I will be sending out updated emails and videos on the social medias and stuff like that. And whenever I get to a certain point, like the label making for the can or the different flavors for upcoming drinks and stuff like that, originals get to vote on that and you get to have a direct input on what we do. So if you want to be part of this new movement that I'm doing with Morale, which is a mushroom-based nootropic drink, head down below. I'll put it in the description. Other than that, this is a long video, and we've already done a long intro. So sit back, get yourself a cup of tea. Let's see. It looks very solemn here, doesn't it? Let's see what he's got to say about the most disturbing human experiment ever.
When discussing humanity's history and tales from our past, it's often comforting to look at those stories through a lens of superiority. After all, in the modern age, people have more information and are more connected to each other than they ever have been before. So when we look back at tragedies and atrocities that people have committed, it's easy to apply a label of ignorance and just say that they weren't in the same position that we are now, so it makes sense that they did the things they did. But
I don't abide by that. I think that people are just as intelligent now as people back 1,000 years ago. And with intelligence comes a moral choice. Yes, life was a bit more violent a long time, like further back in time you go. But people are still people. And so, yeah, if people are doing nasty stuff back then, they know it's nasty still, just as like we would know it's nasty now. Does that make sense?
regardless of any label or explanation that you could come up with, it's hard to justify the evils of Unit 731. Unit 731 was officially a public health department within Japan during World War II. Although now we know, as the years have revealed, Unit 731 was in actuality perhaps the most disturbing case of human experimentation ever. The actions that Unit 731 did for the perseverance of a country and an idea is hard to imagine any person doing for whatever selfish reason, much less the entire efforts of a military and government. So
it's giving me, do you remember the Russian experiment, sleep experiment vibe? I did a video on that on my channel. In fact, I think that became, let me have a look real quick, one of my most popular videos ever on this channel. I did a video, let me have a look real quick. Yeah, it's up there with nearly 1 million views. It's like in the top 15 of my videos, the Russian sleep experiment, which is a very weird story, isn't it?
Today, we're going to talk about the history and tragedy of Unit 731, as well as the incredible injustice that befell everything in the end. Now, before we get started, I just want to mention that while I am going to be careful with my language and not be too explicit with some of my wording or details, the topics we're going to be broaching still relate to intense violence against women, children, prisoners of war, civilians, and all manner of executions, both standard and barbaric. And while I do think it's important to talk about these things, not only for the victims who were destroyed by this tragedy, but also so that the evils that were done by man are never forgotten lest they be repeated.
True. Also, he's really good at like starting this story, is really like roping you in, isn't it? With that being said, yeah, warning, I'm sure, for some of the descriptions of what happens.
And while I think all that's important, I also want to say that if you are sensitive to these topics, it's not worth your own health and mentality. So again, if this video is something that you don't want to deal with, or if some of the topics that I briefly mentioned are too intense, feel free to click off now. And
I think that's really important that he's put that in there, because there are a lot of people with PTSD, especially in the military and stuff like that, that act tough and don't realize that they're watching certain stuff that can trigger certain things from back in the military. I've got friends who you'll just be talking to them about random subjects, and all of a sudden, like, they'll just choke up or whatever. And so even the toughest people have gone through some stuff sometimes, and it's hard to talk about it. So just bear that in mind, okay?
So for those who are sticking around, the video is going to be a bummer. There's not a lot of jokes or fun to be had with this one. Like I said, I think it's important to talk about, but it's just going to be sad and a lot. And I can't wait to get done filming this so that I don't have to think about it anymore, and I can just push all this trauma onto you all. Before we get into that, and it's just, you know, sad for the next half hour, however long this video is, why not do something a little quirky, a little weird right now to kind of lighten the mood a bit? Like, I don't know, maybe I could try to radicalize my audience. So with that out of the way, let's get into something that really matters. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. But do you know what hasn't been a disaster? Raid Shadow Legends!
My God! Why is it always Raid Shadow Legends?
Today. Thank you all so much for watching the ad, and thank you so much to Raid for sponsoring the video. It really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. QR code and link in the description, and we are back to the video.
I don't think I ever said it, by the way, which I'd say at the start of every video. If you want to watch the video without me waffling over the top, it's in the description down below. Go over to Wendigoon's videos, give it some love. I feel like I say that at the start of every video so everyone knows it now, but just for people who don't know it, please go over to the original video and give it some love, okay?
We're gonna go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So the history of Japanese warfare and the Japanese government that led up to the creation of Unit 731 is pretty extensive, but I want to keep it to what's relevant to the events of World War II. To set the stage, in 1925, the Geneva Convention banned the use of biological and chemical weapons. This was done because during World War I, one of the most brutal parts of trench warfare was the use of chemical weapons. And while this treaty deterred several nations from using it altogether, not every nation was in agreement with the Geneva Convention.
True.
One of these being Imperial Japan. Now, as you're going to see in a moment, Imperial Japan was not one to shy away from brutality. And as it related to chemical and biological weapons, them being banned didn't mean they weren't going to use them, it just meant they were going to be very careful about how they use them. And
the whole Geneva Convention's very strange in it, how it's like, yeah, you can kill people in war, but just not this bad. Like, you can't kill people this bad. The whole idea of the Geneva Convention is very strange, and it's like putting a cap on how much destruction you can do when the destruction in the first place is already harmful, which is a whole nother rant, isn't it, really?
During the 1930s, Japanese researchers began to dig into the possibilities of biological warfare. To make sure we're all on the same page, by biological warfare in this context, I'm referring to things like weaponizing diseases or using infections as a battle implement. The issue with this was, or
quick note, if you think that countries aren't still doing that, then you are easily misled, because countries are still doing this type of stuff around the world.
At least the issue from the Japanese government's perspective is it's hard to test the feasibility or practicality of biological weapons if you don't have a population or group of people to test said weapons on. Also during the 1930s, Japan began to attack the mainland of China. At this time in history, China was really struggling to reach the modern age, at least technologically, and a lot of their defensive forces were made up of small communities and bands of soldiers, whereas in opposition to them, Japan had an incredibly strong military force. So most of the conquest of China is called a conquest because the Chinese would try to put up the best fight they could, but would just keep getting destroyed by the Japanese government at every turn. So we see all these pieces moving on the board. Japan is interested in biological and chemical warfare, and they're starting to make headway into the Chinese mainland. And again, this is all like a decade before World War II would even begin.
I feel like I don't know enough about that side of the conflict. Obviously, as someone who grew up in England, the extent we learn about the world wars are from a Western European viewpoint, right? We know what the Soviets were up to and all that lot, but it was mostly about France and Britain's allies and the Battle of Britain and D-Day and you know, Battle of the Somme, if you go back a bit, like all these different kind of big events that happened to Britain more than anything. And so, yeah, I kind of wish I knew a bit more about that side of the war.
Around this time, the Japanese Surgeon General named Shiro Ishii came forward and said that Japan needs to make headway into biological warfare because everyone could tell.
What's going on with my hair here, guys? It's doing my head in. Also, imagine being that guy and being like, we should do that. Like, what a fool. What an absolute fool that guy is. That guy should have been stopped as soon as he started saying that crap.
A war was on the horizon, and if Japan doesn't get to it first, then one of the other powers, like the United States, might beat them to it. The Japanese government, being in agreement at this concept of a biological arms race, in 1932 appointed Ishii as the head of the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory. Publicly, the purpose of this laboratory was to investigate cures for illnesses and diseases that could befall a military force, when in actuality, they were trying to find new ways to make illness befall a military force. This group also had a division within part of the Japanese-controlled area of China. The unit there in China was known as the Togo Unit and was a part of this biological warfare initiative. Something else to keep in mind.
I feel like that rings a bell, like I've heard that before. I might be wrong, but I feel like I've heard it before somewhere.
And whenever we talk about this. So at this point in history, Imperial Japan was especially prejudiced against anything that wasn't Imperial Japan. A lot of the ideas that were made manifest through these experiments and Japan's actions in World War II come from a cultural sense of superiority. As a matter of fact, a superiority that's so strong, it justifies taking over and controlling everyone else. Because of that, several members of the Japanese government and military saw anyone who opposed them as less than human, or at least less than Japanese. And if you'll remember what I mentioned earlier, it's hard to test biological weapons without test subjects. So the Togo unit decided early on that the perfect way to test these new weapons and ideas was with residents of mainland China.
It's weird that a culture can get to the point where they think that they're above every other type of human, or type of human is not what I'm looking for. Every other country, right? Every other, like, I don't know, like, well, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is. Every other culture, that's the word I'm looking for. That they think that they're above every other culture. Like, to be so, I don't know, like, isolated in your country thinking that it's above everything else is bizarre, isn't it? Like, it's so weird. Like, as a Brit, I don't think the, you know, Spanish culture is lesser than British culture. It's just a different culture. It's a different style of living. It's weird that a culture can develop and think they're above other people. You know what I mean? Other types of cultures. It's weird.
Initially, this research was carried out at a location known as the Zongma Fortress. The fortress was an old castle-like structure that was built in Manchuria, China, and was repurposed for the Togo unit's needs. The early experiments at the Zongma Fortress typically consisted of bringing in civilians from mainland China and throwing them in the various rooms of the fortress that were converted into prison cells. Inside of these cells, initially, the subjects would be fed well and kept up to good health, and then at that point, the experimentation could begin. Taking these now healthy test subjects, the researchers would then do things like slowly bleed them out over the course of several days, or dehydrate or starve them to see what the effects of the body would be and how long the subject could survive. Again, this was all done in the name of better understanding the limits of the human body. During the course of these tests, they would also be subjected to various diseases like the bubonic plague, and at various stages of infection, the subjects would be vivisected, or a live dissection, most often while the subject was still conscious. This was done to see firsthand what the effects of certain diseases do to someone's internal system. These experiments would pale in comparison.
The thing is, though, that doesn't make sense because it doesn't have, like, just think of it from a science perspective. People are different, right? And so if you starve someone, you can't get like proper data from that because everyone's different. Someone might last an extra day or two than you. They might last less than you. So it doesn't make sense to even attempt to do that. It makes no sense even from a science perspective, you know? Like, I get the effects of what can happen after a day or two, but you don't have to kill people and torture people to, like, get that data. Does that make sense? Like, why are you opening someone up while they're still alive? Like, I feel like there's a part of, like, malice there that they want to inflict pain to do these types of experiments.
To what this group of researchers would go on to do. Things were kind of tenuous at the Zongma Fortress. Again, at this point, it's a group of researchers, not soldiers, who are doing this. And while a part of the Japanese government, it isn't a one-to-one with the Japanese military. So because of that, there were a few accidents that occurred at the facility. In 1934, there was a prison break, and a bunch of the prisoners escaped out into the Chinese countryside. In 1935, there was an explosion, and a large part of the fortress was burnt. But in spite of these incidents, the Japanese government liked the concept of these new means of warfare. So in 1936, the Japanese government gave them more funding and more access to military reserves.
But it's not like what would they possibly achieve apart from hurting people? It's just a torture camp. That's all it is.
Which not only included a lot of money, but things like Japanese soldiers for guard duty, or Japanese prisoners for experimentation. When Shiro Ishii's group, which again at the time all of this was referred to as the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory, whenever that group was brought into the Japanese government, it was renamed by Hirohito as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. So again, a word to imply to the public that the group's entire purpose is to make sure that everyone's safe. It was at this point that Ishii's group was officially given the designation of Unit 731. The group then focused all of their efforts into China because, again, that's where most of the test subjects were coming from. But instead of going back to the Zongma Fortress, they now went to a brand new Japanese military research facility. This facility was a massive complex that had over 150 buildings and encompassed over 2 square miles.
So they definitely had a large amount of funding then, didn't they? Jeez.
Fascinating things to note about the structure of the building is there was this large, like, welcome center or area that supposedly anyone who enters the complex has to go through, but that was actually a fake building that was just done for publicity purposes, because in actuality there was an underground tunnel that they would shuttle prisoners in and out of outside of the public view. So not only was the name and purpose of the facility a lie, but the actual structure and some of the buildings of the facility were a lie as well, as the majority of experiments took place in these underground tunnels and cells. Now, into the late 30s, as Japan began to take over more of China, there were other facilities that began to pop up that were also a part of Unit 731, but the primary experiments and travesties that happened took place at this large facility located near Pingfang.
It's interesting how quickly Japan was humbled, thinking they were better than everyone else. And I know that the whole atomic bomb thing was horrific in itself. But the thing that always kind of plays into my mind is after it, when they surrendered. Do you remember that story about was it the American general or something that went to visit the Emperor of Japan and stood next to him to show that he was so small or something, just to kind of like show the public, like, hey, he's just a person. He's smaller than I am, or something like that. There was some sort of weird thing to just stop this, not pride, but like thought that the Japanese people had that they were better than everyone else at the time, you know?
1939, Unit 731 consisted of over 10,000 individuals. Now, not all of these 10,000 members were a part of human experimentation. You got to understand, Unit 731 is encompassing the way diseases could be treated, how diseases may be made manifest, and a lot of the experiments that were happening at these other facilities might have been legitimate or had some purpose other than torture. But as far as the events that happened at the primary facility we talked about, those were all pretty evil. The excuse for this large facility as to why they bring in so many Chinese prisoners and exist out here in the middle of the woods away from public eyes is that they were a part of lumber production. So the code name given to experiments that had to do with human experimentation was called Maruta, because Maruta is Japanese for logs. And it was kind of an in-joke in the facility that instead of referring to the prisoners and subjects as prisoners and subjects, they would be called logs. Like, for example, how many logs were cut down today? Or do the logs look healthy? This whole code word thing would keep up through a lot of Unit 731's research. For example, several of the researchers who performed the experiments on prisoners firsthand would publish their findings, but they would publish them saying that it was a long-tailed primate that they did it to.
Oh my God. It's almost as if the more you find out about this, the worse it actually gets, isn't it? The worse it gets. Like, just them referring to him as not human and stuff like that. And it almost would make a culture of workers there who, again, like, enjoy this horrific act. Oh, it's so bizarre, isn't it? It's definitely up there with some of the worst atrocities of the World War, then, if that's the case. Obviously, you've got the Holocaust and stuff like that, which is horrific. Absolutely horrific. And I don't know what the scale of this was. Like, I wonder how many people were actually down there and were tortured.
Or in some instances, even referring to these subjects as Manchurian monkeys. Again, the Japanese government knew what was happening, but the rest of the world didn't, and the Japanese government would prefer to keep it that way. A lot of the numbers vary, considering several researchers probably came and went during the height of World War II whenever these experiments were at their worst, but at least one point, Unit 731 had about 300 researchers as a part of the Maruta or human experiments at this primary facility.
300 people.
What kind of experiments were happening here at this primary facility of Unit 731?
They had 300 people there working there, and not one of them were like, I don't know, guys, it's a bit sus, this, isn't it? 300 people. Oh my God.
That I have been trying to put off talking about all the other aspects of it so I don't have to get to it. And why is it regarded by many to be the worst example of human experimentation, or by some, the worst example of government action against a population ever? So I guess I need to talk about that now. And this is your final warning. Click off if you don't want to hear about it. And I don't blame you. So let's start with how the prisoners got to the facility in the first place. As mentioned, the majority of the subjects were people from the Chinese mainland. While the majority of these were Chinese people, there were also several Russians and Mongolians and Koreans who were captured as well as several Japanese political prisoners who were transferred to the facility as well. They would be transported to the front of the facility in a vehicle that had no windows, so that if there ever was an escape, or if they were ever let out for whatever reason, they couldn't testify where the facility is even located. And then once they got to the facility, they were bagged and taken to the aforementioned underground tunnels. From there, they were placed into an underground cell Most of them on their way in would be given a vaccine for their own health upon entry, when in actuality they were being injected with various diseases, and the disease
my
would
God.
change based on whatever study the researchers were currently carrying out.
Oh my God. So they were already like, as soon as they got in the door, they were doing this stuff to them. There was no like planning. It was just like all pre-figured out. Oh my God.
Exact estimates of how many people were taken prisoner are kind of nebulous. On the most conservative end of the spectrum, it's about 3,000, but that number could be as high as 30 or 40,000 people who were actually taken to the facility.
Oh my
However
God.
many the true number might be, no one ever survived the Unit 731 experiments. The
So there was literally 0 survivors. They all died. That's crazy.
reason no one's sure how many died in the first place and it took so long for this information to come out is because no one that ever walked into that building ever walked back out. So what happened to these prisoners? Well, the thing I mentioned that happened at the Togo facility, the stuff about them being made healthy just so they could be bled out and dehydrated, that was still happening, but that was the least of the prisoners' worries. The average lifespan of a prisoner at Unit 731 was about 2 months. If you were lucky, then you were killed quickly in one of the conventional weapon experiments. These experiments were exactly what they sound like. They would take several of the prisoners and place them in a courtyard. One of the things they would do is they would place people in rings at various distances from each other and then throw a hand grenade in the middle to see what lethality the grenade had out to these different rings of people.
Oh my God. Like, why do they even need to do that, like, with living things? That makes no sense. It's pure evil and stupidity, isn't it? Like, I don't understand why they thought, well, this is the thing, right? They must have really lived in a environment that made them genuinely believe that they were above other people, right? For them to even get to that point. So you have to look at like their upbringing and what their parents were telling them and what their parents were telling their parents. Do you know what I mean? Like what was the environment? Like would they see that they were above everything and everyone? And if that's the case, then it would make this culture of seeing people from other cultures as like cattle, right? But you wouldn't even I wouldn't even do that with animals though. So it makes no, I don't understand it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't understand how someone can do that and be like, good experiment, guys.
Would set people on fire with flamethrowers and see how long it took them to burn up. They would line up people in a straight row and then shoot them with rifles and pistols to see the penetration capability. They would sharpen bladed weapons to various degrees to see how sharp a knife needed to be to fully cut through somebody. And of course, as mentioned, this was all done to participants who were fully awake and conscious of the death they experienced. And again, that's if you were lucky. If you were unlucky, then you were a part of the disease trials. So the disease trials were similar to the things mentioned in the Togo unit, where they would infect people with things like the plague and then dissect them while they're alive to see the various stages of infection within the body. But they had been doing the bubonic plague research for years at this point. Again, the time period we're talking about now is generally like 1940, 1941. So the plague research has moved on to much larger demographics. Again, a lot of the records...
They did say that this was in a base in China though, right? So like, I'm sure he's going to get onto it, but what happened to this place, like the base? Like, did it get destroyed? Did it get blown up? Did it get raided? Like, how... He's going to get into it. And I think my brain's just ticking ahead of like, I already want to know. I want a bit of justice. I think that's what's happening here.
Of Unit 731 were destroyed at the end of the war, but from what we know, there was at least 12 field tests of things like the bubonic plague, and 11 of them took place in Chinese cities. So Unit 731 researchers would deposit plague-infected fleas into the middle of a Chinese populace or infect their wells and homes with things like typhoid. And then these researchers would watch from a distance and then walk through these decayed cities in their sterile garbs, recording the number of casualties. At the very least, tens of thousands of people died immediately from these large-scale weapon tests. Entire countrysides of people were destroyed, by infected fleas that were simply thrown out in a clay pot. Back at the
It's just interesting to see that I've done a lot of videos now on, obviously it's a military channel, right? So I've done a lot of videos on like war and the horrible stuff that happens during war and the weapons used during war and stuff like that. It just seems like there's no upper limit to what people are willing to do during a time of war. And this is why the Geneva Convention's there, right? To stop stuff like this from happening. I get you could say someone getting shot is someone getting shot in the military, right? Like it's just as horrific as any other death. And it's hard to give, like, you can't give a hard line on this is okay and this is not okay. You can do the horrific stuff that still happens today in wars where missiles are exploding on people's houses, but you're not allowed to do this other stuff. But it's almost because there's no upper limit to what people are willing to do during a wartime, like the Holocaust and these horrible, horrible events. People have had to turn around and set the Geneva Convention and be like, well, look, like, innocent people are getting caught up in stuff that's absolutely horrific. So there needs to be a cap on this. I am someone who, as I've got older, have realized that no military is innocent, right? No military is better or more, I don't know what you would say, honorable, right, than any other military, unfortunately. And I'm a big believer that we should as a society, and it'll never happen, but we should as a society kind of just embrace not doing wars anymore and dealing with tricky situations through other means, because we have the means to be able to do it. It just so happens that there are individuals in this world who believe, one, that they are better than other people, or that they think that their culture is above other people's culture. I mean, look at like North Korea, right? With the guy who runs North Korea, he's just Kim Jong-un or whatever he's called. Like, he's obviously just, he thinks he's like the emperor of the world, right? And he wants his people to believe that. And it just feels like it's them type of people. It's these type of people who they just want more and more power and more power and more power. And there's people who you don't even see, right? Who have a crazy amount of power. And for some reason, there are individuals who they want everything. And it's because of them individuals that war would never stop. And this type of stuff will go on for the rest of human existence, unfortunately.
The facility, the feasibility of chemical and biological weapons was being tested as well. They would have prisoners stand out in fields wearing different layers of protection, from completely naked to normal clothes to gas masks and what have you, and then they would just bombard them with things like mustard gas or sulfur gas and see how long it takes them to die at whatever stage of protection they're in. Another thing that the researchers were interested in was weaponizing venereal diseases. So to do this, they purposefully infected a bunch of people with STDs. However, the injections of the STDs tended to not take properly, so as an alternative, male and female prisoners were led into cells and then at gunpoint forced to transfer the diseases. And as mentioned previously, at various stages of the disease's progression, the individual would be vivisected to see what it's doing to the body. And even all of that is within the realm of feasibility. As evil, as depraved, as monstrous as it is, you can wrap your head around the concept of, okay, well, if someone really, really believed that the people they were torturing aren't really people, and that this is all for the greater good, you can see a purpose, to them at least, they can see a purpose at the end of the tunnel as to why they're doing this, right? Well, that's before we get into what I can only describe as Machiavellian torture methods. Because sure, they're wanting to use...
Well, what is going on to here is it gets worse and worse, because it seems like they can't... There's no upper limit of what they're capable of, right? So these people will do these experiments and be like, all right, well, let's make it worse. And it must be like some sort of ingrained, work environment culture and I know I'm making a pun of work environment, but it's like that lab, the 300 people that work there, the culture between them 300 people is just constantly bolstering each other and like reassuring each other, and they're in an environment where they think that they can push it even further and further, right?
Use new diseases in the war, so they got to test those, right? But some of the other stuff they did was simply no other explanation than depravity, or at least none other than I can think of. So to just read off a few of the things that happened at Unit 731, and again, these are things that records were not destroyed of, and people would later confess to. So if it's possible, it is very likely that worse stuff than this happened as well. People were cut open while alive and had various organs removed before they were stitched back up to just see what would happen. So for example, cutting out someone's lower GI tract to see how long it takes them to die from that.
Oh my
taking out
God.
someone's stomach and attaching their gut to their throat to see what that does. People had their limbs cut off, in some cases to visualize how long it took for someone to bleed out, but in other cases, they would saw off both arms and then switch the shoulder that the arm was attached to just to see if the body could reattach it. People were placed inside of low pressure chambers and the pressure cranked up to see how long it took for things like their eyes to fly out or their chest to implode. People were hung upside.
Who was it who recommended this video to me? Who was it? Which one of you was it? I'm gonna find you. I'm gonna message you back and be like, how dare you send me that video? At the same time, I've realized that Wendigoon is an absolutely fantastic storyteller, because I haven't even commented on that yet because I'm so engrossed in the story.
Down by ropes tied to their ankles to see how long it took them to die from blood pressure to the head. People had very large and heavy objects like crates and rocks dropped on them to see how much force it took to kill someone from being crushed. People were placed inside of centrifuges and the speed ramped up until they were dead to see how much G-force it took to kill someone. And as depressing as it is, I should also mention the fact that they determined that children had a lower tolerance to it than adults. People were given intravenous injections of things like horse blood and seawater, again, just to see what would happen. People had their limbs placed in very cold buckets of water until their limbs were removed, and according to researchers, it felt and sounded as if it was wood, and then the limb would either be crushed to see what the damage of a frozen limb that becomes injured might be. They were set on fire to see if anything could be recovered from that. They tested various ways to warm someone back up after they were frozen to that degree. According to Ishii himself, again the lead researcher, they did various experiments where they took babies that were under a month old and placed them in freezing water and freezing elements just to see how long it took them to die of hypothermia. I'm going to read this next one from an excerpt from Hal Gold.
I hope this guy, I don't even know what justice would serve something like this. Feels like sitting in a prison cell for the rest of his life just isn't justice, is it?
He wrote a book called Japan's Infamous Unit 731, which is a book breaking down this whole topic. And Hal says in one portion, it was said that a small number of these poor men, women, and children who became Marudas were also mummified alive in total dehydration experiments. They sweated themselves to death under the heat of several hot, dry fans.
Oh my
At
God.
death, the corpses would weigh only about a fifth of their normal body weight. And in some cases, they
Oh
would
my
just decapitate
God.
people and take notes about it. It really is bizarre the level of insanity this entails. Like, not only is it evil, but it's also so dumb, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you just cut someone's head off, what are you even studying? Like I said, you know, of course it's evil. I'm not saying obviously that any of it was better than the others, but when a military tests a weapon, as evil as it is, you could think to yourself, okay, I understand why they did that, but some of these things, just like mummifying people, shattering their frozen limbs, leaving babies out to die, like, it's a strange debauchery.
Well, this is what I was saying. Like, I think what happened is they made an environment where they thought this stuff was okay. Like, that must be the only explanation for it, because it really is the most ridiculous stuff in the world, right? Like, it's ridiculously horrible. Like, it's almost like supervillain horrible from like a movie, like an unnecessary, motively horrible thing. Do you get what I'm saying? When you make they make really bad films, and the evil person is just evil for the sake of being evil. Kind of like Voldemort in Harry Potter. Like, there's no reason he's evil; it's just evil. In my opinion, it's a bad character in a book, but they're just evil for no reason whatsoever. There's no reason for it. It's almost like that. Like, they're doing this stuff just to be evil, and there's no. It must have just been the way they were brought up and the environment that they're in that believe it's okay to do this stuff.
There's all these stories we hear about that, like when Rome fell, there were these big swinger parties and everyone would get high until they were dead, right? And a similar thing happened at the end of World War II in places like Nazi Germany. It's like they were like rapping on the gates of death, just going to go out in a blaze of glory. But this was a group of scientists who did it for a couple decades. Like, how, or at least the intensity of it for 5 years, right? Like, we don't even have the excuse that they were about to die, or they thought they were just going to bust hell wide open. Like, it was just a continuous, thought out evil with seemingly no purpose that was signed off by members of governments, military, and the scientific community. And that's what makes it so terrifying.
Yeah.
Perhaps the worst fate of anyone in Unit 731.
He's not said the worst fate yet? Jesus.
Or I'll say definitely the worst fate, was of the pregnancy studies. So as mentioned, the average lifespan of someone in Unit 731 was about 2 months. That number is skewed a bit because a lot of people who got there were killed within the first week, and things like the weapon testing. The reason that the average comes out to 2 months is because several of the studies were women who were, similar to the STDs, forcefully impregnated by either another prisoner at gunpoint or by one of the guards themselves. Similar to the other diseases, a lot of them were dissected while alive at various points in their pregnancy just so they could look at how the fetus was developing. And in other cases, the women were effectively used as a breeding stock so that the researchers could have a fresh batch of infants for several of their tests, like the hypothermia test as mentioned earlier. And you know what gets me about it? Like, I've looked at so many disturbing things. As a matter of fact, I knew a lot about Unit 731 because I covered it on the disturbing movie Iceberg. There is a film that I should have looked up before I started recording. There's two of them. There's Philosophy of a Knife, which I talked about in the disturbing movie Iceberg, and Men Behind the Sun. Both of them go into graphic detail about what happened at Unit 731. So I had seen those, so I'm like, wow, I already knew that, you know, the Japanese government did all of these evil things to these people. And I, you know, knew about the Frozen trials, knew about the chemical weapon trials, even things like the pregnancy experiments. So, like, I knew all of that going into research for this. But the part that threw me off, that I wasn't expecting that I would see, actually, believe it or not, came from Wikipedia. Typically, Wikipedia is a horrible source to get information from because people can just change stuff, and sometimes they just flat out make it up. But whenever I was brushing up for this, I decided I'd look at Wikipedia to see how they had it laid out. And they had an account that I hadn't read anywhere before that kind of stopped me in my tracks. There's at least one recorded instance of friendly social interaction between prisoners and Unit 731 staff. Technician Naokota Ishibashi interacted with 2 female prisoners. One prisoner was a 21-year-old Chinese woman, the other a Soviet girl who was 19 years of age. Ishibashi asked where she came from and learned that she was from Ukraine. The 2 prisoners told Ishibashi that they had not seen their faces in a mirror since being captured and begged him to get one. Ishibashi sneaked a mirror to them through a hole in the cell door.
Interesting.
And that bothers me so much more than a lot of the other information I read. And the reason for that is because, again, I'm pretty desensitized to just brutality, right?
It shows that there was instances where there was a little hint of regular humanity there. And for some reason, these workers suppressed that natural urge to help a fellow human in favor of the brutality. And my presumption, it was through peer pressure or the culture of the environment. It's got to have been. I think peer pressure, humans have this innate thing where we don't want to be kicked out of our tribe, right? Like, you always get told about this stuff. You don't want to be considered different or strange or weird, or people like to follow trends, right? Like, we all do these things as humans. And the reason we do that is from a tribal perspective. If you look back at humans when we lived in small groups, we didn't want to be kicked out of that small group because you wouldn't survive. And so you would have to want to do these things that other people do, right? And so that must have been what it was.
Like, the number of historical stories I read about that has to do with people getting, skinned alive, or, brutal executions. Like, that's just history, right? It's bloody, it's brutal, evil's always existed. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, it is a lot easier to throw a label of ignorance on top of everything, right?
Yeah.
Like, we take it for granted in the modern age because everyone's hyper connected by the internet, right? Like what you're watching this video on right now. And it's really easy for us to take human connection for granted. To just say, well, of course, I know that this other group of people is of equal worth as myself because I talk to them. I know several of them. I experience it. And it's easy to go in with that mindset and look at history and be like, oh, well, yeah, I could see how the Imperial Japanese would, be so tricked by their government because they just weren't as educated. They weren't as enlightened as we were, right? So it's easier to read stories about things like Unit 731 if you kind of turn your brain off and you're like, this was a group of people who just didn't see the others as human, and that's why these tragedies were allowed to happen. But then I read the story of a guard who saw two girls, young women, who wanted to remember what they looked like, and he recognized that they needed to feel something, that they needed to have that.
There's a touch of humanity there. That's what it is. That's all it is that there was a touch of humanity there. And it was weird that he had to do it on the sly. And it shows that other people were watching, right? And there was some sort of pressure there.
So he broke rules and snuck them a mirror. And it made me cold. Because then it's not just a person who let themselves get tricked and convince themselves that they were dealing with cattle, right? Even, which if these experiments were done with animals, I think we'd all still agree that it's evil and terrible.
Yeah.
But maybe that was his mindset, right? That he's just dealing with animals. But to read that he took pity on a girl who two girls who wanted to remember what they look like terrified me, because at least some of them were fully aware that these people were suffering and that was wrong. Not just that they were suffering and this was for the greater good, but that they were suffering and something should be done. And in spite of that, it kept happening.
Yeah.
It was such a powerful force of government and people and the greater good that these tragedies kept going on, and the people who participated were well aware of the pain they were inflicting and didn't stop it. And that is so much worse than a group of people who were just following their orders and turned off their ears.
Yeah.
This guy still had ears, he was still listening, and he kept following those orders. Along that same note of kind of the illusion of us versus them fading, there was one, I believe he was a guard there. Some said guard.
It seems like I'm hoping he gets into the point of what happened to this place. But I like the way he's done his videos where there's storytelling aspects, and then it's almost as if he tells the story, then goes into a discussion, and then he'll get to the next point and tell the story and go into a discussion. And I like the way that he's kind of... and I think he's naturally done that. I don't think he's intentionally done that. I think that's just who he is as a person by the looks of it. Like, he's tried to get this subject and give you the information about the subjects and then give you his perspective. And it looks like that's his way of, I don't know, teaching the audience in these videos, right? I really like it. I think I got that from his iceberg videos because he would tell... Although with that one, it was like, because there was so many different layers to the iceberg, he was trying to get through the subjects quick. He would tell a little bit of it and then give his opinion, move on to the next bit, tell the story of it and then give his opinion. And it was constantly that two kind of flip of facts, opinion. And he's doing it on this video, but at a larger scale. and it really works well with his storytelling.
Some said he was like a research assistant. Someone who wasn't a high-ranking researcher named...
And I'm going to go back a second, actually, because I got some more to say on that. I actually think maybe he does do it intentionally. Maybe he does know that he's doing this. And he gives this little bit of... Because he's going into it here now. He's telling another bit of a story. And watch, he'll give his opinion on it after the story is kind of like a chunk of this video. Maybe he does it intentionally, or maybe he does it unintentionally. I do it sometimes when I'm telling stories. Like, I'll tell a story and then just automatically say what I think about it. And so maybe that's just natural for him like it is for me. Or maybe he intentionally does it, but some people won't know because he's very good at this.
Versus them fading. There was one, I believe he was a guard there. Some said guard, some said he was like a research assistant. Someone who wasn't a high-ranking researcher named Yoshio Sudo, who got infected with the plague while he was there because, you know, everyone's dealing with these volatile diseases. So one of the workers gets infected. So they cut that guy open. Like, I guess they figured, well, he's a test subject now. We're not going to let him go to waste. Who cares if he's Japanese? And they sliced him open too. It's interesting. While kind of the Japanese government's idea was, well, we're more important than they are, so they can suffer. But we see these glimpses of the Japanese who are infected being treated the same as everyone else who's infected, and also the Japanese recognizing that these people have emotions and feelings, and it makes the situation so much more scary.
Yeah.
In the end. And I think one of the reasons it is...
See what he did there? He told it, and then he went straight into that. And I think this is him telling us his opinion on it now. He's really good at this.
So scary is because, again, we read a lot of stories like this, and it's comforting to think, oh, well, if they just knew better, right? Like, oh, well, maybe if they didn't have to struggle for resources as much, or maybe if they maybe if they were allowed to experience humanity from this other side that they seem to hate so much, maybe then, you know, they wouldn't have had to do the awful things they did, right? It's easier to read a lot of history that way. But you see instances like that, and it kind of, it's dreadful, the idea that, sure, they had all that, it didn't change anything. Near the end of World War II, the Japanese government got desperate and decided to rely on Unit 731 for some kind of drastic measure against the United States. So, using the bubonic plague research that the Japanese had figured out, again by testing it on residents of China, the Japanese government put together a plan called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan for this was to release the bubonic plague on San Francisco, and the attack was scheduled to take place on September the 22nd of 1945.
Wow.
But this plan never came to fruition because just over a month before September 22nd, America dropped the atomic bombs on Japan and ended the war. In these final days of the war, the members of Unit 731 realized that the war courts would not err in their favor and decided to destroy whatever evidence they could. And of course, this evidence began with the prisoners, who were forced to either ingest poison or be shot before the facility itself was set on fire and most of the documents and research destroyed. And as mentioned, no one who ever entered Unit 731 as a prisoner ever walked out. When Douglas MacArthur came to Japan after the war was over,
he might have been the guy that I was talking about earlier, how he went to the Emperor of Japan and stood next to him and had a picture taken just to not belittle him, but like make him not look as powerful as he really was.
He immediately heard whispers of things like human experimentation. After tracking down Ishii and the other leaders of Unit 731, they confessed that some degree of human experimentation took place, but wouldn't give MacArthur specific details. MacArthur threatened that if the remnants of 731 don't comply with the United States, then the United States would allow the Russians to judge the members of Unit 731. And I don't know if you know this, but especially right after World War II, you much wanted to be in a United States tribunal than a Russian tribunal, because Americans typically ended with prison sentences and Russians ended with rope. So a deal was struck between MacArthur and the head researchers of Unit 731 that said if the researchers of 731 turned over all of their data to the United States, then they would be given full immunity. And of course, both sides agreed to that deal. Now, a couple things.
So they got immunity for it just because they handed the data over? That's not a vibe. I don't like that.
The reason this deal was done is because, one, and most importantly, America was afraid of what might happen if the Russians, who shortly after World War II began the Cold War and all of that, or the Cold War began between the United States and Russia, I should say. America was afraid of what would happen if the Russians got their hand on all of that information. So it was more so done not so America could have biological weapons. I mean, we're not dropping plagues on populated cities, at least. That's what they want you to think. But
Yeah, you never know these days, do you?
really, it wasn't so much that we could have the information as much as we didn't want the Russians to have the information. And the other reason that the deal was taken is because, not really that I think it would have changed anything, but most of the details of what happened weren't known until decades after World War II ended. Like most of the stuff I read about came out in confessions in the 70s and 80s.
So it would have been confessions from people on their deathbeds, wouldn't it? More likely than anything.
MacArthur knew that there was some level of human experimentation. I mean, the data he was handed talked about how long it took for the researchers to witness someone dying of hypothermia, right? Like, he couldn't have been totally dumb to it, but at least the brutality and methods of it, they probably weren't aware of at the time. Not that I think that would have stopped them from it, but maybe they wouldn't have given full immunity. Maybe I just like to think they wouldn't have given them full immunity if they knew the full extent, but whatever, it still happened. Now keep in mind, to the public at that time, none of this had ever happened. To the Japanese government, to the Chinese, Unit 731 was a crazy conspiracy theory if you thought anything weird was happening out there, because it's just for public health and lumber for some reason. So whenever the immunity deal was made, part of the deal was that America would keep up the lie that nothing ever happened at Unit 731, and all of the members of Unit 731 could change their name, and America wouldn't release their identities to the public.
Wow.
So after America makes this whole plea deal with them,
So they completely got away with it, didn't they? Oh, it's so infuriating that there are people out there that do horrific things and don't have consequences. It's just so infuriating, isn't it?
eventually Russia shows up and they actually have a trial for some of the members of Unit 731, and as you can imagine, didn't care to consult the US over it. So Russia holds a trial, and they end up getting 12 people who they can confirm were in Unit 731, and the sentences for those 12 who were found guilty were 2 to 25 years in a labor camp, of which the most any of them served was 7 years. Now, if you know anything about Russian history with war crimes, the idea that these men weren't shot or hanged is absurd. Especially that they ended up just serving 2 to 7 years, respectively for different people. That is insane. How did that happen? Well, if you'll remember, the American deal with the Russians wasn't made official until like the 80s, and some researchers were going to talk about, put in the work and made it come to be. So the fact that the Russians show up, they talk to the Japanese for a while, and only a few of the 731 researchers get like 5 years in prison, it is pretty much guaranteed that the Russians made a deal with the Japanese, very similar to the deal America made with them. So at the end of
So you're saying basically that he thinks that Russia took this data as well of the chemical weapons. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but the whole thing just seems like an absolute shit show, doesn't it?
the day, this group of people who were monstrous demons even committed a massive amount of bloodshed and misery, and then when the going got tough, they sold that bloodshed and misery to the highest bidder and got off scot-free. So
Yeah.
ain't that a kick in the pants? Now again, none of this was public information, and it would have stayed that way if it wasn't for the work of various Japanese historians. See, again, Unit 731 for years was like a boogeyman. There would be a researcher come out in like the 60s or 70s talking about how the project was real, or they were a part of it and they can attest to it. And they would get laughed off by the media, saying that they were just some crazy conspiracy theorist. Historians pulled various records in Japan.
It just goes to show now what's the same thing happening right now, where people are like, look at what they're doing, and everyone's like, oh, look at this guy. When in truth, it could be happening. Oh,
that supported the government's sanctioning of Unit 731. And in 1983, a historian published his findings and was told by the Japanese Board of Education that he should take those findings out of textbooks because it's not backed historically. So these historians went to the United States, and now, because everything's declassified, went through various records and found MacArthur's immunity deals and the records that he got directly from the Unit 731 experiments, and were able to bring those records back to Japan, show them to the Board of Education, and say, it's real, it's all right here. And from then on, the Japanese government slowly began to admit fault in the Unit 731 experiments. Through the 1990s, the Japanese government finally acknowledged that it was a real thing, but not the specifics of what the researchers actually did. The most recent development of Unit 731 was in 2018, when the Japanese government named the 3,607 researchers who were a part of the unit. And as you
3,600 researchers were part of the unit. 3,600 people let this happen and were involved with it. Wow. That is infuriating, isn't it?
Imagine between all 3,607 of those names, they're all either dead or have disappeared. Shiro Ishii, if you'll remember, the leader of all of Unit 731, died on October the 9th of 1959 from laryngeal cancer, never experiencing judgment on this side of eternity for his role in the Japanese war crimes. And Unit 731, like I said at the beginning of this video, is depressing. There's no two ways about it. There's no happy ending. There's no good side to it. It was a group of people committed atrocities, and they got away with it, effectively. And there's no polish I can give that. But what I can give polish is that this story was almost entirely lost for history. If you were from World War II, from these events happening up until like 1984, when it finally became official, the people who died never died.
It just goes to show that, like, this one got released. How many other horrible things happened that we don't know about still? And I guarantee it's a lot of them. There's a lot more that we don't know about than we do know about. I guarantee it.
At least publicly. Their names were just lost, as some of the many names lost in World War II. And they were just a statistical anomaly, because governments didn't want to acknowledge the atrocities that they had once condoned, or that the forerunners before them had condoned. And of course, obviously, I don't mean any of my critiques of the Japanese government during World War II to apply to now. But again, that was less than a century ago. It's hard to think about that humanity is capable of that kind of evil and that kind of justification for that kind of evil. But the point I want to bring out, the one light in all of it, I could say, is the people who would not be quiet. The people who kept learning, who kept digging, and now we have names of the perpetrators, and we have death of the victims.
It just shows that reporting on this type of stuff, not only is it incredibly brave, because these people could have very easily been killed off. They weren't. But it's also very important, right? There's too many stories we get these days of people diving into certain subjects and then just mysteriously dying and stuff. And it's just, you start to realize as you get older that there's more stuff in this world that we don't know about, and it's terrifying.
We have cause of the victims. And while it doesn't make it right, and the suffering still happened, it gives some meaning to it. Their names are not simply lost, they were taken. And hopefully by understanding why they were taken and what great evil led to it, we can prevent tragedies like that from ever happening again. And like I said, Unit 731 is a heavy story, but it's one that I think should be told.
Yes, 100%.
Not one I enjoy telling. I didn't have a good time recording this, I'll be honest. But it's one that needs to be.
Yeah.
And I'm just a lowly YouTuber. I'm no one important. I'm no one special. But hopefully you got something out of this. Or at least you have more depressing knowledge to terrorize your friends with, which in that case, win-win. But either way, if you got something out of this, or you just like to be miserable like I do, I guess, that's cool. And I just want to say, Thank you for watching. Thank you all so much for sticking around and watching the video. I know I promised that the Ted Kaczynski video would be next, but that video is becoming a much larger project with a lot of really cool things that I've never done before, and it's taking more time. So hopefully whenever it does come out, you all will be excited and it will be worth the wait. I hope you like that teaser in the ad, and hopefully that made the rest of this video not as depressing. But if you
He's a very, very good storyteller. I have to give him that. He's a very good storyteller. I'll let it finish off here. There's only like a minute left.
you made it this far, I appreciate it, and I hope it wasn't that much of a bummer. And I want to emphasize, while I talk about a lot of the disturbing and worst parts of humanity, I am talking about the outliers. I am talking about the strange parts. Humanity, just as capable as it is for infinite evil, is capable of infinite good.
True.
And don't let yourself get, you know, in a headspace about how terrible the world can be, but get in a space about how great it can be as well. I recently, I'll brag a little bit, my fiance Kayla just graduated with her doctoral, so she's a doctor now. And that's
Fancy.
incredible, and I'm proud of her. And it helps seeing people like her, people who strive, people who have power and diligence and strength. And it really is easy to take your mind off the terrible when there's so much good to be found.
True dat.
So
True dat.
again, I hope it
All
didn't
right.
get you that sad. And if I did, I'm sorry.
He's waffling a bit at
But
the
I
end
hope
here.
that you enjoyed. Shorter video for now, but like I said, Ted on the way.
Shorter
There'll
video?
probably be another video in between this one and the Ted one, because like I said, that's becoming a big one. But expect
This is
the
a
Ted
short video?
in June, and hopefully you enjoyed that.
Christ.
But until then, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.
Jeez.
When does
This was a short one? Holy crap. Let me see how long his other videos are. Let's have a look real quick. Yeah. Oh my god, he's got a 9.5 hour video on the conspiracy iceberg. He's got a 5 hour video about Blood Meridian, the book. Isn't that longer than the book itself? No, the book's pretty big, actually. Well, it's not that big. It's not that big. I haven't read it, but apparently it's a good book. I'd have to look at his video. What a great video. It's very interesting how a lot of people recommended me his channel because of his storytelling capabilities. And although that was a very depressing story, by the looks of his videos, they're all kind of weird, I don't know, like horror kind of occult kind of videos. It goes to show that even with a very horrible subject like that, you can still appreciate someone's storytelling quite well. His storytelling capabilities are very good, and he's obviously refined it over time as well, hasn't he? So, yeah, thank you to whoever recommended me. Thank you for making me incredibly depressed now. It was a very sad story, obviously, a very haunting story. But again, just like Wendigoon said, it's definitely something that needs to be told, isn't it? So yeah, thank you for watching. If you want me to check out more Wendigoon, then I will do it in the near future. Link down below to his channel. Go over there, give it some love. He obviously deserves it. He puts a lot of effort into this content. So go over there, give it some love, subscribe to him and all that good stuff. Also, check out Morale, my new business coming out, my new mushroom business I'm very excited about. It'll be down below as well. Until next time, I love you all. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.